Samantha Jennings, do you think Paul was a Stoic? And why do people say Jesus was a cynic? Whoa.
That's an excellent question. Yeah, I do think Paul was what we would call a Stoic. That's, again, not a dodge. Whether he would have said, like, I'm a Stoic philosopher, I'm not sure. But he liberally uses Stoicism. He never stops saying he's a Pharisee. But that doesn't mean that he's not happy to use Stoicism as a supplement to whatever other claims he's making. So let me back that up with one other piece of information that might be helpful to contextualize this, which is that Paul is like Philo, is like Josephus in the extent that, and there's a scholar named Arthur Urbano who has written on this, that you see quite often with these Jewish writers in the first century, that they'll cite Platonism, they'll cite Stoicism, right? They themselves are very much steeped in Platonism and Stoicism, but they maintain the primacy of Judaism. And in Paul's case, he maintains the primacy of his position as a Pharisee. Josephus, by the way, also a Pharisee. And they try to claim that actually, like, you think Platonism is so great, you think Stoicism is so great. Moses thought about that way before. Plato thought anything, or like Zeno of Citium thought any of this stuff up. There's a way in which within, like, you see almost like this argument mounted among these Jewish thinkers that they recognize within, especially through the Septuagint, the Hebrew Bible, many of the same ideas about ethics and the way that the world works that you already see in the Hebrew Bible. So Philo, for instance, when he talks about Genesis, he notes that God breathes into man, but breathes into man. The word is pneuma, right? So of course Philo's going to be like, see, like you Stoics who think you're so smart, like, we had this in Genesis way before you guys.
Yeah, that's the kind of mentality he brings when I read him.
Yeah, and it's great. It's
Sure.
really interesting to see that kind of cultural competition, but sharing. It's no wonder Gentiles were curious about Jewish holy books, right? Because, like, if they think Stoicism's like the science of the day, and then you're claiming you run into Paul, you run into Philo, who's like, by the way, like, you ever read Genesis?
Right.
Like, in the Greek translation, we had all the same words. It was already there. You can see how that narrative starts to build, or at least that cultural competition builds. And some of it's explicit, some of it's kind of implicit. So I would think, Paul's a Stoic. He is using Stoicism, again, very liberally. Whether others would have recognized him as a Stoic, whether he claims he's a Stoic, not quite.
Sure.
But he never quite he doesn't use the word. He always maintains he's a Pharisee, but we see a lot of discourse going on that's very complicated around that issue.
I just thought of a good analogy. Sometimes in music, you can be in the rock genre, but you're literally rapping or something. Like,
yeah.
You call that person a rapper, or do you call them a rock star?
Yeah, I like that.
So yeah. I don't know. Maybe that's,
Well, and also, like, what is more advantageous for the individual to claim at the time too, right? Like, Paul is able to, his whole argument is that the Jewish Messiah has come, right? So he's going to want to make that argument, especially as a Pharisee, using the Septuagint. His whole job, like his whole claim to fame, all of his authority derives from the fact that he's a Pharisee who's well-educated, who knows how to interpret the law, right? So, like, he's going to emphasize that. And that seems to be the thing, like the unique thing he brings to the table when he talks to the Gentiles. It's not just like the run-of-the-mill Stoicism, like I mentioned Elizabeth Rawson's work before, where you can find any Stoic on a street corner, right? But he is literate. He can interpret these holy books, and he's well-versed in Platonism and Stoicism to the extent. Now, I say well-versed, he kind of has his own innovation, like he's not to the book on these things, but he's well aware of these philosophies, and he's able to deploy them. As for Jesus the cynic, it's because cynics, usually they have kind of an interesting characterization. They like to kind of challenge themselves by living in the elements. They were a little bit countercultural. They're more subversive. And certainly because Jesus, living in the Galilee, being somebody who's not an elite, who is portrayed as somebody of a lower social stratum of society, might be more aligned with that group, at least not philosophically in terms of the actual philosophy, although there are scholars who argue Jesus the cynic, seeing some of his quotes or his so-called teachings as related to some ideas of Stoicism on that subversive key. but also the idea that he's, he's not Marcus Aurelius, right? Like he's not one of these sort of exalted philosophical figures. So it's kind of both. It's like that perception element, but also certain aspects of his teachings, especially when they subvert social expectation, sound more Stoic.
Yeah, there's a story about Diogenes. His disciples asked him what they wanted to do with his body after he died, and he told them, "Throw me over the bridge with a sword tied to my hand so I can fight the fishes." They're like, "Huh? Why would we do that?" And he's like, "Exactly. Why would I care what happens to me if I die?"
That's super Stoic.
And
that's super cynic,
Yeah, and I think of Jesus saying, "Let the dead bury the dead." And I'm like,
or like, the kingdom in Gospel of Thomas, like the kingdom of heaven is like a man who kills another man. You're like, what? Like anything that makes you go, huh? That's cynic.
Yeah. Exactly. So I can see that. That's the good question, Samantha. Thank you for that super chat.
Very good question.
B-Bear, thank you for the super chat. Why do you think Thomas was called twin?
Oh, there's a later tradition about this. There's actually a lot of kind of late antique theology going on here, which like we start to depart from my area of knowledge there, at least, or like my area of like deep understanding of the trajectory. But there is a thought that Jesus had a twin in the womb in some circles, that he was fully divine and that Mary had another son that was also that was fully human. So there's that whole like didymus is the term sometimes you hear. So there's a later theology about that. There's mention of, usually you have these attributions for other characters you see, especially in the canonical Gospels that kind of get their own spin-off story. So you have a lot of associations between that and this idea of a character of Thomas, because you have the Gospel of Thomas, you have the infancy Gospel of Thomas, you see these references over again. Why that theology develops, that's the thing that I'm fuzzy on. I'm not sure. I understand it theoretically in terms of like, trying to create an attribute, like a certain kind of Christology of like divinity. But I'm not sure.
It's such a weird topic because it's like, how come the Gospels don't say when he was born he had a twin? Like, but like, I don't know. There's a million things I ask about that, but who knows?
I once TA'd a course on late antique theology, which is like where like there's a cobweb box like somewhere in the back of my head with all of this. And I can remember there would have like these church fathers would have like whole gatherings where they would just like debate like the nature of Mary's womb. And I'm like I guess you had to solve these questions later on. But I always kind of picture, like these kind of dusty dudes getting together in like a board meeting, like, talking about somebody's cervix. It's just kind of weird.
It is a little strange, but thank you for that super chat. Drawing Down the Stars. This is one of my best friends. Go and subscribe to this new and up and coming channel. And thanks for the super chat. Appreciate it. How much of a role do mystery typewrites play in the early Christian churches?
Okay, such a great question. This was really a popular topic, I would say like around the 1970s and 80s. I might be a little off there, but kind of like the generation before I came up in the field. And people were noting that there were a lot of similarities in terms of like salvation narratives and certain kinds of practices or ideas about an afterlife. And then for one reason or another, that sort of like died out as a topic. Now, I know that there are some people in the field who are working on this again. So I just want to flag that there's a bit of a return to it. To some extent, it kind of lost some steam. There's one scholar named J.Z. Smith who talked about this a little bit. And like, he talked about like dying and rising gods and that kind of thing. And it started to kind of, after his definitive work on it, started to kind of fall out. But people are revisiting it now. The thing that immediately comes to mind to me is certain rites around like Mithras. Even if you go back into the Greek tradition, rites around Demeter.
Eleusinian.
Yeah, the Eleusinian mysteries. I mean, Christianity doesn't have anybody taking their piglet to the beach or making bread in the shape of a penis, but which is part of the Eleusinian mysteries.
Right.
So maybe the one-to-one comparison doesn't exactly work. But you still have this idea of going into the underworld, right? Or redemption and return. We know the Roman army was very into this kind of stuff too. And so you have an idea that what we would call mystery cults were interesting to them as well. So some of those rites, I do think you see some overlap in the rites themselves. The practices the specific practices. You see some kind of correspondence, but one of the problems like something like the bread making, right? Like you have like the body and blood and similar kinds of language. The thing where it starts to fall apart a little bit too is with the mysteries. One reason we call them the mysteries is we don't exactly know everything about what took place during the mystery rites. So we're left a little bit in the dark at times about exactly what was going on. But the work of Chris Zeitman comes to mind. He just wrote something about the Roman army. There's a scholar named Bijan Omrani who's working on a book on the mystery cults in early Christianity. I mentioned J.Z. Smith. There's a scholar named Nancy Evans who's written about the Demeter cult, and she knows quite a bit about early Christianity. So I can think of some scholars who have worked in this area and have noted some of the parallels that might be worth pursuing.
And also, Mary Beard's Roman religion book, she talks about how in the Eleusinian Mysteries, the idea of bread is like eating Demeter because she's the grain, and then wine is Bacchus, and Bacchus would enter you when you in the state of the frenzy. Yeah. But also you have this idea of baptism being the initiation, and like that might remind you of Apuleius. There's like all these different like things you're looking around and
that's why there's not that one-to-one correlation, but you see like and that's
the zeitgeist of the time. Yeah.
And I'm glad people are looking at this again, because it was really simple, and at least scholarship again, like I don't want to mischaracterize anything, but like when there was a move to do these comparisons a few generations ago, it was because there was that recognition of like the death and rebirth, right? That seems to be a theme in many of these mystery cults. Like you go into a dark room, from the best we can tell, like you go in a dark room, you hear some weird things. And, if you're part of like, the Orphic mysteries, like you're supposed to be guaranteed some kind of like afterlife scenario or something, right? So or again, the bread and the wine, perfect example, that these are pre-existing cultural ideas that get revisited in a new key in Christianity in certain ways. But you don't have that one-to-one exact, like, this mystery cult is exactly what Christianity picks up later. Yeah.
Oh, I just thought of something. With Mark's gospel being sort of a mystery story, does that make it because I know the mysteries are like more about the rituals, but would a story being a mystery play into that?
I think that's more genre. Yeah. The thing with mystery cults is that usually they had some formulae that, like you recited or something, right? And sometimes those are the things we don't know. Like what was the code word, basically, or like what was the safe word when you were like, being haunted by somebody.
Yeah, they had like I put back in the chest. I took from the chest.
And if you look at the Orphic gold tablets, there's all kinds of formulae and things like like we can reconstruct some of this stuff. But really, I think Mark as a piece of writing is a genre. But the thing you're highlighting there is that, especially in Gospel of Thomas too, comes to mind for this. Gospel of Thomas starts off by saying, anyone who can understand what I'm about to say will never taste death or something like that, or, will taste eternal life. And so when you have that kind of like...
Dervani Pyrus, Orpheus says, for those who have ears to hear, and the rest of you be silent, like get away.
And so there's that idea of like in-group, sort of back to that question that Derek asked about, are there Christians behind? Like you do have a sense of in-group here, or like... some kind of mysterious answer to a question. You see what I mean? Like you've got that idea operative there, and so I think that's a shared element here too. But again, slightly different, but definitely resonances. Let's at least say, like doing that comparative work, you see a lot of resonances between the two.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, and go and subscribe to Drawing Down the Stars. Myth Vision Podcast is back with another one. I can't wait for your lectures. Do you think the 1 Corinthians Creed is a legendary in nature? We can point to the Gospels as legend, but Paul and that creed?
We talked about this when I saw Derek last, and I think I wasn't sure then. I'm not sure. I'm sure. Now, I have a tendency to see these things as a little bit more nebulous than like the idea of an actual creed being what Paul had in mind. And I'm not quite sure. Tell Derek to write another note. Like, can we point to the Gospels as legend? If we're trying to get down to like, we know Paul's writing to some group of some kind, right? Like the idea that they might have some kind of creed, okay, like that's totally fine. It doesn't actually challenge much except to say that Paul's invoking, some kind of language to try to give a sense of community possibly to this group that, especially with the Corinthians, is otherwise not. But I would have to think a little bit. I have to keep thinking about this, and he can ask me the next time. I'll do some more homework on trying to decide whether
it is a very interesting question, and I don't know if anyone can say for sure, but yeah, it's something to look. I'd be interested to hear how you, as an expert, look at that. So thanks for that question, Derek. Shane Torrey, thank you for the super chat. Dr. Walsh, what is your position on the authenticity of the contested Pauline epistles, and what do you think are the best arguments against them?
Okay, so the uncontested ones, if I can remember this right, I feel like this is a pop quiz. So we got 1 Thessalonians. This might not be in the exact order, but 1 Thessalonians, you got Galatians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Romans. And I think Philemon, most people count Philemon, and then there's always debate about Hebrews. And I think that there's been a renewed debate about Hebrews, but Hebrews, I think, is usually a contested Pauline epistle. I would say a couple of things. Here, again, I'm going to invoke the work of Candida Moss, who just had an article published about Paul. And again, thinking about, he says at one point in Galatians, like, look at how big my handwriting is, right? Like large letters. It seems as though he's dictating to somebody to write some of his letters at times. And this relates to her work on enslaved literate workers. Again, she's got 2 articles on this and one that just came out on Paul. So the argument for and against, I would say an argument for some of them being actually Paul is, what if he's dictating his letters to somebody and they're just they have their own writing style, right? And so that's why you see some change in language. Usually people determine authentic and inauthentic Pauline letters based on how often does the language mirror what we expect Paul to say, because he has a certain way that he talks that we are able to trace by the number of times he uses certain vocabulary words, or the certain number of times he uses certain kinds of linguistic constructions. Meaning all of us write in a certain way, right? Like some people love to open like a sentence with a prepositional phrase, right? Some people like to write with certain kinds of a range of vocabulary that's comfortable for them. We see that with Paul, and that's how we were able to determine his authentic letters through that kind of active comparison. But what if he dictates a letter to somebody else who has a different range of vocabulary or style, right? So that would be an argument in favor of all of them being authentically Pauline. Now, the reason I don't think that they are, and I tend to respect the line that's been drawn within the field between the authentic and the inauthentic letters, so-called, is because the theology changes so radically in 2 areas in Paul that I think stand out. One is that Paul goes from being like, the kingdom of heaven's going to be like a thief in the night, right? And you don't know when it's going to come, to like, it's already here. It's all around us, right? Like you see such a radical departure, because even by his last authentic letter, Romans, he understands that there's been a delay, but he rationalizes that in a different way. He doesn't say like, it's already happened, you just missed it, or like, it's living amongst us already. It's a very, very different. He basically says it's because we haven't figured out the right number of Gentiles yet, or like you're not behaving right. Like he doesn't make it this other kind of argument of like, let's not talk about that. Like, let's sweep that under the rug. And then you have the problem with women, especially in the inauthentic letters where, Paul is writing to Phoebe, he's writing to all these women. He sometimes talks about, in 1 Corinthians, these disputed passages about women, ask your husbands about what's going on. Don't talk, in the assembly and veil your head, right? The idea of men being the head of the woman and, et cetera, right? But those usually or primarily appear in the Corinthian letters where he has specific problems with the Corinthian women and the Corinthian assembly for acting certain ways, speaking in tongues and acting in certain manners that he doesn't seem to have a problem with in the other letters. So that might be either, some people say those passages are interpolations. Some people say that he just has specific problems with the Corinthian women. There was a woman named Clark Wire who wrote a book called The Corinthian Women Prophets several years ago that talks about this. That was quite good. So those those are the issues people usually cite. By the time you get to the inauthentic letters, certainly by the time you get to the pastorals, you have more like institutional structure, concern for like hierarchy within the church, and concern for women taking a more socially acceptable and traditional role. And so between all those kind of radical departures, it looks like there is a bit of a dividing line between what's authentically Paul and what scholars tend to think are not. But again, and I want to be clear, it's not Moss's argument that the inauthentic Pauline letters are actually Paul because he might have dictated to somebody, but she does pose the question of, even from an authentic letter where we see the large letters, Paul talks about writing in his own hand, look what big handwriting I have, that it does seem he is dictating to someone. So how can we begin to explore that? What are the consequences of that? And she's doing a lot of innovative work in that area right now.
Wow, thank you for that answer. Thank you for that question.